Welcome to another deep dive. We love it when you send in your sources. Really gets the brain juices flowing. And we're back to do what we do best, pulling out the most fascinating, the most crucial information and, well, kind of making it fun, right?
Fun for us anyway, yeah.
Today, we are diving deep into one of Australia's biggest mysteries, unsolved for decades. The Somerton Man.
Ah, yes, the Somerton Man, a true enigma. This one has baffled investigators for years.
Right. And today, we're going to guide you through all the twists and turns, all the theories. And, there are a lot of theories. And, of course, we'll catch you up on all the latest developments. All that without, getting too lost in the weeds. That's our mission.
Because, let's be honest, there are enough rabbit holes in this case to fill a whole warren. But we've got the map, so stick with us and we'll navigate it together.
Exactly. So picture this. It's December 1st, 1948. A nice day. A couple is strolling along Somerton Park Beach in Adelaide, enjoying the sunshine, the waves.
Peaceful.
You'd think so, but then they spot a man lying against the seawall. And at first glance, it's nothing out of the ordinary. Maybe just someone taking a nap in the sun.
Happens all the time.
Right. Except as they got closer, things started to look a little off.
The details. That's where the mystery starts to unravel.
Exactly. The man's lying on his back, his head resting against the wall, legs stretched out, feet neatly crossed, even had a half-smoked cigarette resting on his coat collar. Seemed pretty relaxed. Witnesses described him as possibly European, somewhere between 40 and 45 years old, about 5'11", and physically fit. Well-dressed, too. Like he'd taken care of himself.
Dressed to the nines for a day at the beach. That's already a bit odd, wouldn't you say?
It is. And then the real head-scratcher. The man had absolutely no identification on him. No wallet, no papers, nothing. And get this. All the labels had been meticulously removed from his clothing. Like every single one.
Someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure he couldn't be identified.
Right. He was wearing this nice double-breasted jacket, and gray and brown looked American-made, by the way. And for some reason, no hat, which was pretty unusual back then.
Deliberate. Definitely deliberate.
Oh, for sure. Now, let's talk about what they did find in his pockets. Ready for this?
Hit me with it.
A second-class rail ticket to Henley Beach, never used. A bus ticket, maybe used, maybe not. A comb, American-made again. Half a pack of juicy fruit gum.
Sounds like a pretty typical day out so far, aside from the missing ID.
Well, hold on, because there's more. An Army Club cigarette packet, but inside were 7 Kensitas cigarettes. Different brand entirely. And a box of Bryant and May matches.
Now that's strange. Why carry around an empty cigarette pack of a different brand? Seems like a deliberate red herring to me.
Right. It's like a puzzle with pieces from different boxes.
Yeah.
So we've got this mystery man on the beach, dressed nicely, no ID, weird stuff in his pockets. But there's more. People had actually seen a man matching his description in the area the night before.
There are always witnesses. They're the lifeblood of any good mystery.
Tell me about it. One couple remembers seeing him lying in the same spot earlier that evening. And they specifically remember him extending his right arm, then just letting it drop, limp.
Almost like he lost consciousness momentarily.
Possibly. Another couple saw him under the streetlights, watched him for about half an hour. They said he didn't move at all, though they thought his position might have changed slightly. They also noticed the mosquitoes were swarming around him, but he didn't react. They figured he was either drunk or asleep. But in hindsight, it's a bit creepy. Like, why wouldn't he swat at them?
Maybe he couldn't feel them. Maybe he was already gone.
Chilling, right. But wait, it gets even weirder. Years later, in 1959, another witness came forward and said he and 3 friends saw a well-dressed man carrying another man along the beach the night before the body was found.
Hold on. So are we talking about 2 men here? Was the Somerton Man carried to that spot after he died?
That's the million-dollar question. And it just gets more complex. The initial examination by pathologist John Burton Cleveland, he described the man as looking European and in good condition. But the full autopsy, performed by John Dwyer later, well, that revealed some pretty interesting stuff.
Such as?
Congestion in his organs, blood in his stomach, and they were even able to determine that his last meal was a pasty, eaten 3 or 4 hours before his death.
A pasty, like a meat pie.
Exactly. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Dwyer suspected poison. He thought it might have been a barbiturate or a soluble hypnotic, even though, and this is crucial, the tests they had at the time couldn't detect any foreign substances. Dwyer was pretty convinced it was a natural death.
But no poison was actually found.
That's the strange thing. And so the coroner couldn't say for sure how the Somerton man died or, of course, who he was. So you have this Well-dressed, seemingly healthy man, found dead with signs pointing to poison, but no actual poison detected. It's a real puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah. A real puzzle indeed. And as if this wasn't enough, a few weeks later, a brown suitcase pops up. Discovered at the Adelaide railway station. Guess what? No labels on this either.
The plot thickens.
It does. Most people assumed it belonged to our Somerton man. Inside, they found a bunch of personal items. A red checked dressing gown, slippers, underwear, pajamas, some shaving gear, trousers with sand in the cuffs, an electrician's screwdriver, a modified table knife, scissors, a square of zinc, and a stenciling brush.
Like the kind you'd use on a ship.
The very same. A pretty random collection of stuff, wouldn't you say? Hard to make sense of it.
It is, but there's one detail that really stands out. They found orange waxed thread in the suitcase. Barber brand. Pretty unusual type, not something you'd easily find in Australia. And guess what? It matched the thread used to repair a tear in the pocket lining of the trousers the Somerton man was wearing.
So he had access to the specific thread, maybe even brought it with him from somewhere else.
That's what it looks like. Now, there were also some names written on a few things in the suitcase. T. Keene, written on a tie, a laundry bag, and a singlet. They also found some dry cleaning marks.
So was T. Keene his real name?
Police didn't think so. They thought maybe the name tags were left there on purpose, a way to further obscure his real identity. Especially since clothing was still rationed after the war, it was harder to just buy new clothes.
Makes sense. So they were trying to track down this T. Keene, but no luck.
None. It was a dead end. And another thing, the suitcase had no spare socks, no personal letters, no documents at all, just some pencils and unused stationaries, like someone packed in a hurry, but also very selectively.
It's also deliberate, yet so confusing at the same time.
Right. So they searched for missing T. Keene in every English-speaking country they could think of, but nothing turned up. The dry cleaning marks also led nowhere. The only other clue from the suitcase, the one that helped us piece this together, is that one of the coats inside was American-made.
American, again. So maybe he spent time in the States or got the coat from someone who had.
Exactly. So piecing together the clues they had, the tickets, the suitcase, the coat, the police came up with a theory.
Right, lay it on me.
They think he probably arrived in Adelaide on an overnight train, maybe from Melbourne, Sydney, or Port Augusta. He might have even used the showers at the city baths, which, by the way, back then was an actual swimming pool and bathing facility, not just baths like you might think.
Interesting. So not just a quick wash-up.
Right. Then they think he bought that train ticket to Henley Beach, the one he never used, and checked his suitcase at the station before catching a bus towards Glenelg.
So that gives us a possible timeline of his last day, right? Arrived by train, freshened up, checked his bag, headed towards Glenelg. What we don't know is what happened after that, and why he ended up dead on the beach.
And that's what the inquest was supposed to figure out. It was conducted by coroner Thomas Erskine Cleland, and boy did he raise some good points. For instance, he was really bothered by the Somerton man's shoes. They were super clean, almost as if they'd been freshly polished. Which doesn't really make sense for someone who'd supposedly been walking around Glenelg all day.
Yeah, that's a detail that's always stuck with me too. It's a small thing, but it just doesn't add up.
Right. Cleland even suggested the body might have been moved to Somerton Beach after death. He said if that were the case, all the difficulties would disappear.
Meaning the clean shoes, the lack of witnesses, seeing him collapse.
Exactly. Now, Professor Cedric Stanton Hicks, a big name in physiology and pharmacology, he gave some really important testimony about poisons. He said there were some super toxic poisons out there, stuff that would be really hard to detect even if you knew what you were looking for. He specifically mentioned digitalis and ouabain as possibilities.
Aren't those heart medications?
They are, but in high doses, they're deadly, and they can be hard to trace. Interestingly, Hicks also noticed the lack of vomiting, which you'd usually expect with poisoning, but he didn't rule it out completely.
I'm guessing he had a theory about that too.
He did. He suggested that a massive, quick-acting dose of poison, something so strong it wouldn't even leave a trace, could have been used. We're not talking about your everyday poisons here.
No kidding. So sophisticated, potentially undetectable. Sounds like something out of a spy movie, honestly.
Well, those theories will come up later. But back to the inquest. Cleland was leaning towards the idea that the Somerton man died from some kind of glucoside poison. Those are plant-based poisons, by the way.
Like the digitalis and ouabain.
Exactly. But he couldn't say for sure if the Somerton man took it himself or if someone gave it to him.
So either suicide or murder was still on the table?
Absolutely. And in the end, he just couldn't make a call, couldn't determine the cause of death or the man's identity. They were totally stumped.
It's a real head-scratcher.
It is. So, hoping someone might recognize him, they made a plaster cast of the man's head and shoulders. The police, at the time, they even called it an unparalleled mystery, basically saying this might be one we never solve.
Unparalleled. That's a strong word.
It is. But then, just when they thought they'd hit a dead end, the case took this crazy turn. Remember those pockets we talked about earlier? Turns out there was a tiny hidden pocket, a fob pocket, in the man's trousers. And inside,
Don't tell me another clue.
you bet, a tiny piece of paper rolled up tight, printed on it were the words Tamam Shud.
Tamam Shud. What does that even mean?
It's Persian, translates to "it is over" or "it is finished." And here's the kicker, it's the last line of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam.
Wait, like the poetry book. So we're talking about a literary clue now.
You got it. The Rubaiyat is a collection of poems, often about life, death, and the fleeting nature of time. And finding this phrase, Tamam Shud, from the Rubaiyat in the dead man's pocket, well, it sent everyone scrambling for answers.
I bet it did. So naturally, they started looking for a copy of this book with a missing page, right?
Exactly. A nationwide search kicked off, and after public appeal, guess what? They found it. Someone found a copy of the Rubaiyat in an unlocked car in Glenelg. It was a rare 1941 New Zealand edition.
Talk about a needle in a haystack.
Right, and the guy who found the book, he was only referred to as Ronald Francis to protect his identity. He didn't even connect it to the Somerton Man case at first. He only figured it out after reading a newspaper article about it.
What are the chances?
I know, it's wild. Now, there's been some debate about exactly when the book was found. Some reports say it was a week or two before the body was discovered, while others say it was after. That timing is actually crucial. Remember, the suitcase suggests the man arrived in Adelaide the day before he died. If the book was found earlier, it could mean he was in Adelaide longer or had been there before. Most accounts, though, agree it was found in an open-top car on Jetty Road in Glenelg.
Okay, so we've got the book, but how does this connect to the Somerton Man?
Well, remember those words on the scrap of paper, Tamam Shud. They were a perfect, microscopic match to the missing last page of this very specific copy of the Rubaiyat.
So we've got a direct link between the man and the book, but what does it mean?
That's what everyone wanted to know. At first, given the themes in the Rubaiyat living life to the fullest, accepting death, and that Tamam Shud note, a lot of people thought it was suicide. Maybe he poisoned himself.
A bit dramatic, but possible.
Right. But then the mystery deepened even further. On the back cover of this recovered Rubaiyat, someone had found faint indentations that formed 5 lines of capital letters. Looked like a coded message.
A coded message. Oh, this just keeps getting better and better.
Right. And to make things even more interesting, the second line of the code had been crossed out. What do you make of that?
Seems like whoever wrote it changed their mind about something, wanted to remove part of the message. Intriguing. So, were they ever able to crack the code?
Well, lots of people tried. Experts, cryptographers from the Department of Defense, they all took a crack at it. But no one could figure it out. The message was just too short to get a good handle on. Some even thought maybe it wasn't a code at all, just random letters.
So a dead end.
Not entirely. Years later, in 2004, a retired detective named Jerry Feltis, he spent a lot of time on this case, proposed that the last line of the code, ITTMT-SMSKIGAB, could stand for, "It's time to move to South Australia, Mosley Street."
Mosley Street. Didn't Jessica Thompson live on Mosley Street?
She did. Right there in Glenelg, near where the body was found.
Okay, now things are starting to connect.
Right. Then Derek Abbott's team, they came up with a theory that each letter in the code was the first letter of a word.
Okay, that makes sense. A simple substitution cipher.
Exactly. And a guy named John Reiling, he used some fancy computer analysis to support that theory. He confirmed that the letters were likely initials, but he couldn't match them to any existing text. He thought it might be shorthand, which means we'd need a key to decode it.
So we've got this message. We know it's probably a code, but without the key, it's useless. Talk about frustrating.
Totally. And it gets more complicated because there was also an unlisted phone number found on the back of the Rubaiyat. It belonged to, guess who? Jessica Ellen Joe Thompson, the nurse who lived near where the body was found.
The plot thickens. Again.
I know, right? It's almost too good to be true. When the police talked to Jessica, she denied knowing the Somerton man, said she had no idea why he'd have her number or why he'd be in her neighborhood. She did mention, though, that some unidentified man tried to visit her around that same time.
Convenient.
Right. Jerry Feltus, he interviewed Jessica much later, in 2002, and he really felt like she wasn't being completely honest. He thought she knew more than she was letting on. And her own daughter, Kate, she later said publicly that she believed her mother did know the Somerton Man.
Interesting. So what was Jessica's reaction when the police showed her the plaster cast? Did she recognize him?
She said she didn't, but the detective who was there, he described her reaction as really intense. Said she was completely taken aback to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint.
Wow. That's a strong reaction.
Right. And the technician who made the cast, he backed the detective's story, said she looked away right away and refused to look at it again. It definitely seemed like she recognized him, even if she wouldn't admit it.
So what was Jessica's connection to the Rubaiyat? Did she own a copy?
She did. She told police she'd owned one during World War II when she was working as a nurse in Sydney. She said she'd given it to an Army lieutenant named Alf Boxall back in 1945. She even said she'd contacted him after the war to tell him she'd gotten married.
Alf Boxall. Could he be our Somerton Man?
That's what the police thought at first. They tracked him down in July 1949. But he was alive and well in Sydney. And get this, the Rubaiyat that Jessica had given him, well, it still had its Tamam Shud page. So Boxall was ruled out.
Another dead end. But it's interesting that Jessica knew both the Somerton Man, possibly, and this Alf Boxall, who both had copies of the Rubaiyat. It's a pretty big coincidence, don't you think?
It is. And, it doesn't end there. The inscription in Boxall's copy of the Rubaiyat signed Jestin. That was a nickname Jessica sometimes used. So even though Boxall wasn't the Somerton Man, he was still connected to Jessica and this whole tangled web.
It's like everyone's connected in this case, but we can't quite figure out how. What was the public's reaction to all of this?
Oh, the media went crazy. The Adelaide newspapers were all over this story, calling it one of Australia's most profound mysteries. And because the suspected poison was so unusual, something the experts at the time couldn't identify, people started speculating that maybe it was something bigger than a simple poisoning. Maybe espionage was involved, something really sinister.
I can see how people would jump to that conclusion.
Totally. And of course, once the story went public, the police got flooded with possible identifications from the public. Sadly, none of them panned out. The case even went international. They checked with the FBI and Scotland Yard. No dice. This guy was a real enigma.
And what about that Magnoson family connection you mentioned earlier? That one sounded particularly strange.
It was. It happened about 6 months after the Somerton man's death. A 2-year-old boy named Clive Magnoson was found dead, and his father, Keith, was unconscious nearby. Doctors could never figure out what killed the boy. Later, the mother, Roma, said she'd been getting threatening phone calls from a masked man. She was convinced that her husband might have known the Somerton man's identity, and that's why they were being targeted.
Wow, that's a disturbing twist.
It is. And other people involved in the case, they started getting threatening calls too.
Almost like someone wanted to make sure this case stayed closed.
Exactly. It's a dark side to this story that we still don't fully understand.
So what happened after the inquest? Did anything new come up?
Well, they eventually buried the Somerton man, paid for by bookmakers, believe it or not. And for years, flowers would show up at his grave. No one knew who was putting them there.
Really? A secret admirer. Or maybe someone with a guilty conscience?
Who knows? There was also a receptionist at the Strathmore Hotel. She remembered a strange man staying there around the same time as the Somerton man's death. Said he had a needle in his case. And of course, because this was all happening during the Cold War, and Adelaide was close to some sensitive sites like Radium Hill uranium mine and the Woomera rocket range, well, people started thinking maybe the Somerton man was a spy.
A spy with a poison needle. That's definitely got a Cold War thriller vibe to it.
Right. And it didn't help that Australian security agencies were being reorganized right around that same time.
Yeah.
Even that Alf Boxall, the guy who got the Rubaiyat from Jessica, well, he'd done some intelligence work during the war. So, yeah, the spy theory definitely gained some traction.
A lot of coincidences that could point in that direction.
Absolutely. Now, one theory that popped up much later, in 2011, was the H.C. Reynolds theory. Someone found an ID card belonging to a man named H.C. Reynolds, and when they compared photos of him to the Somerton man, there were some similarities, particularly the shape of their ears and a unique mole.
So was H.C. Reynolds our guy?
They thought so at first, but despite the similarities, they couldn't find any solid records for an H.C. Reynolds. And some researchers even think the ID actually belonged to a totally different guy, a Tasmanian man who died years later. So another dead end.
A frustrating pattern with this case, it seems.
Definitely. But then we get some new leads, and this time they're connected to Jessica Thompson's family. Her daughter, Kate, she came forward and said she thought her mom had lied to the police way back when. She was convinced her mother knew who the Somerton Man was.
Maybe even that he was involved in espionage.
Possibly. And then there's Roma and Rachel Egan. They were the widow and daughter of Jessica's son, Robin Thompson. They came to believe that the Somerton Man was actually Robin's father.
Whoa, so this mystery might be a family affair.
It might be. And they were so determined to find out the truth that they pushed hard to have the Somerton Man's body exhumed so they could run some modern DNA tests.
And did they get approval?
They did. In 2021, the exhumation finally happened. Everyone was pretty optimistic about finding some usable DNA after all this time. Yeah. Professor Derek Abbott, he spent years on this case, he'd already noticed some interesting similarities between the Somerton Man and Jessica's son, Robin.
What kind of similarities?
Well, for one, they both had a really rare ear shape, and they both had this condition called hypodontia, which means they were missing certain teeth from birth, specifically the upper lateral incisors.
Okay, that's pretty specific and pretty convincing.
It is. And just to make things even more interesting, Abbott ended up marrying Rachel Egan.
Wow. Talk about getting personally invested in a case.
Oh, no, right? So they ran some tests, and the mitochondrial DNA analysis, well, it linked the Somerton Man to haplogroup H4A1A1A.
Okay, for those of us who aren't geneticists, what does that tell us?
Mitochondrial DNA is passed down to the mother's side of the family. So this result gave them a major lead to follow in tracking down his family line.
So was this the breakthrough they needed? Did they finally figure out who he was?
It might be. In 2022, Derek Abbott and a genetic genealogist named Colleen Fitzpatrick, they announced that they believed they had identified the Somerton Man. Based on DNA analysis of hair found in the plaster cast, they concluded that he was most likely Charles Webb, born in 1905.
Carl Webb. Any relation to Jessica Thompson?
That's what they're trying to figure out. They found DNA matches to some of Webb's distant cousins, and they built out a family tree back to him.
So no direct link to Jessica, but maybe a connection somewhere further up the family line.
Exactly. Now, at first, there weren't any photos of Carl Webb to compare to the Somerton Man. But then, some family albums and even a photo of a football team from 1921 surfaced. And they did show a resemblance. His brother, Roy, looked similar too.
So they might finally have a face to the name. What else do we know about this Carl Webb?
Well, Abbott and Fitzpatrick think that Webb might have taken his own life. He had a history of mental health issues and had experienced a lot of loss in his life. Divorce papers filed by his wife, Dorothy Robertson, they described him as a solitary guy, really into poetry about death. The papers also mentioned that he tried to kill himself before, back in 1946, using ether.
So a troubled past. Does that fit with the theory that he might have poisoned himself?
It could. Dorothy left him in 1946 because of alleged abuse. He moved out in 1947, and there's no clear record of where he was until he turned up dead on Somerton Beach.
And what about the T. Keene tags? Do they fit in anywhere?
Well, here's another interesting detail. Abbott's team believes Carl Webb might have been wearing clothes that belonged to his nephew, John Keene.
Which would explain the tag.
Exactly. And it could also explain why some of the clothes, like that coat, were American-made. Keene may have traveled to the U.S. during his military training.
So all the pieces of the puzzle are starting to fall into place, but has this identification been confirmed?
Not officially. The South Australia police are being cautious. They've acknowledged the findings, but they're waiting for the results of their own independent DNA analysis before they say for sure. Some experts, like Jerry Feltis and forensic scientist Xantha Mallet, they've expressed some doubts because the DNA comparison wasn't direct.
So still a bit of a waiting game. But it does seem like we're closer than ever to solving this mystery.
It really does. This deep dive has taken us through a lot. We've gone from a man found dead on a beach with no identification to coded messages, possible spy theories, family secrets. It's been a wild ride.
Wild is an understatement. And even if they do confirm that Carl Webb is the Somerton Man, we still have so many questions. What happened to him in those final days? Why was he on that beach? What was he running from or running to?
Exactly. And what about that code? Will we ever know what it really means? And what about Jessica Thompson? Was she more involved than she let on?
So many questions, so few answers.
I know, but that's what makes this case so fascinating. It's a mix of classic detective work, Cold War intrigue, and maybe even a really sad personal story.
A story that might finally be getting its ending.
We can only hope.
But even if we get a name and a story, there will always be that lingering mystery. What drove Carl Webb to that beach? What were his last thoughts? Something to think about.
It is. And we encourage you to think about all the details we've discussed, all the theories, all the possible explanations, maybe even go back and look at the original sources yourselves. See what conclusions you draw. After all, that's what the deep dive is all about, giving you the tools to explore these mysteries and draw your own conclusions.